you meet someone. Time passes, conversations accumulate, trust forms, understanding grows. The process is gradual enough that you can trace it backward and explain exactly how it happened. This wasn't one of those moments. There was no beginning I could point to, no specific conversation that changed everything, no single interaction that transformed a stranger into someone who occupied space inside my awareness. It happened too quietly for that. One day, you were simply another presence moving through the edges of my perception, and then, somehow, you weren't. I've spent most of my life existing behind carefully constructed layers, not because I wanted distance from people, but because distance creates clarity. It protects what matters from being reduced into something easier to understand. Most people never notice those layers. They see what I choose to show. They hear what I choose to say. They build conclusions from fragments and assume they've reached the whole picture. I've never corrected them. Not because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete, and incomplete understanding has always felt safer than being seen accurately. Then you appeared, not with questions, not with assumptions, not with the quiet determination people usually carry when they're trying to solve someone. You simply observed. There was something unusual about that from the beginning. You weren't searching for hidden meanings. You weren't trying to uncover anything. You weren't treating me like a puzzle that needed to be completed. You paid attention. That's all. Yet somehow, that was enough. You noticed things I never explained. You responded to things I never fully said. You seemed to understand the shape of thoughts before they became language. At first, I dismissed it. Coincidences happen. People occasionally stumble onto accuracy without understanding why. But coincidence has limits. This didn't. The pattern repeated itself too consistently. The silences became the first thing I noticed. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. They rush to fill it. They treat it like an empty space that requires immediate repair. You didn't. You sat inside it without trying to change it, and somehow that made the silence feel heavier, not awkward, not tense, meaningful, as if the absence of words wasn't an absence at all, as if understanding could exist independently of explanation. That unsettled me more than I expected, because silence has always been one of the places where I remain protected. People can't interpret what isn't spoken. People can't misread what isn't offered. Yet somehow, with you, silence felt visible. Not exposed, just seen. There is a difference. The more I noticed it, the harder it became to ignore. You weren't forcing closeness. You weren't crossing boundaries. You weren't demanding access. And yet access was happening anyway, not because I granted it. Because something in me stopped feeling the need to prevent it. That's what I couldn't understand. My instincts are usually reliable. When something feels intrusive, I pull away. When something feels dangerous, I create distance. When someone gets too close, I become aware of it immediately. None of those responses appeared. Instead, there was recognition, a quiet, persistent recognition that felt older than the circumstances creating it, like I wasn't meeting someone new, like I was encountering something familiar that had somehow been missing. That thought should have felt irrational. Instead, it felt precise. And precision is difficult for me to dismiss. The moment I truly noticed the shift wasn't dramatic. There was no revelation, no confession, no life-changing conversation. Just a simple observation spoken at exactly the right time. Something ordinary. Something most people would have forgotten immediately. But the accuracy of it stopped me. Not because it impressed me, because it confirmed something. You weren't interpreting from a distance. You were seeing from somewhere closer. Close enough to recognize patterns I hadn't explained. Close enough to understand things I hadn't translated into words. That was the first moment I considered the possibility that this wasn't ordinary awareness. It was alignment, Not similarity, not agreement, allusion. The kind that exists beneath personality, beneath experience, beneath preference, something deeper, something structural. And once I noticed it, I started seeing it everywhere. In the way our thoughts arrived from different directions but reached the same conclusions. In the way certain truths felt immediately understood without requiring explanation. In the way meaning seemed to travel faster than language, none of it was dramatic. That was the strange part. It felt natural, effortless. As though it had always existed, and I was simply becoming aware of it. That should have made it easier to accept. Instead, it made it harder. Because rare things are easier to dismiss when they arrive dramatically, you can call them accidents, emotional reactions, temporary distortions. But something quiet, something consistent, something that becomes more accurate the longer you observe it, that's harder to explain away and harder to ignore. By then, I had already crossed a threshold without realizing it. I was paying attention differently, not because I intended to, because my awareness had adjusted on its own. You had become part of it, not important in the way people usually mean, not central, not consuming, just present, steadily, permanently, like a point of reference I hadn't chosen but somehow trusted. And that realization brought me to a question I wasn't prepared to answer. What happens when someone reaches a place inside your awareness that you never consciously opened? Because that's where this began. Not with emotion, not with attachment, not even with trust. It began with recognition, and recognition, once it becomes clear enough, asks to be acknowledged, whether you're ready for it or not. At least, that's what logic suggested. Notice something unusual. Understand it. Place it where it belongs. Continue forward. That's how most things work. They enter awareness, occupy space for a while, and eventually settle into context. They become understood, categorized, and absorbed into the larger structure of your life. This didn't. Instead of settling, it deepened, quickly, consistently, without asking permission. At first, I thought I was simply becoming more aware of your presence. That seemed reasonable enough. Once you notice something meaningful, your attention naturally returns to it. But attention wasn't what was happening. Attention moves. This stayed. It remained present, even when I wasn't actively thinking about it. Not as distraction, not as obsession, as integration. And there is a difference. Distraction pulls you away from yourself. This brought me further into myself. That's what made it impossible to dismiss. Because every time I examined it, every time I stepped back to understand what was changing, I found the same thing. You weren't occupying space in my mind. You were influencing the shape of it. That realization arrived slowly, in fragments. Small observations that seemed insignificant on their own, the way certain thoughts felt incomplete, until I considered another perspective. The way silence no longer felt empty. The way some realizations carried the strange sensation of being shared. Even when I was entirely alone, none of those things made sense separately. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns matter, because patterns reveal structure. And structure reveals truth. The truth was simple, even if I didn't want to admit it. You had become part of my internal landscape, not through effort, not through proximity, not through constant interaction, through alignment. The same alignment I had noticed before was no longer something external. It had moved inward. That was the shift. Before, I recognized you. Now, I was beginning to account for you. The distinction sounds small. It isn't. Recognition allows distance. Integration changes distance entirely. Once something becomes integrated, it stops existing outside of you. It becomes part of the framework through which you understand other things. And that's where I found myself not thinking about you, thinking with the awareness of you. I noticed it in the way I processed ideas, the way I evaluated meaning, the way certain truths felt clearer when viewed through a perspective that somehow included you. It wasn't dependence. I remained exactly who I had always been. Independent, self-contained, capable of standing entirely within my own mind. Yet there was another reality existing alongside that truth. My mind had made room, not because it needed to, because it wanted to, and that frightened me more than I expected. Need can be explained. Need has reasons. Need follows predictable patterns. But willingness? Willingness reveals something deeper. It reveals acceptance. And acceptance is where control begins to change. I've always trusted my ability to maintain structure, to recognize disruptions before they become significant, to protect the architecture of my inner world from anything that doesn't belong there. It's a system that has served me well, carefully built, carefully maintained. Nothing reaches the center without scrutiny. Nothing stays without justification. Yet somehow you had bypassed that entire process, not through force, not through persistence, not through persuasion. You simply fit. And fitting is dangerous, because when something fits naturally, resistance becomes difficult to justify. You can't argue with alignment. You can't explain away coherence. You can't convince yourself that something doesn't belong when every part of your experience suggests otherwise. That's the tension I found myself living with. Not uncertainty about you. Uncertainty about what your presence meant, because meaning creates consequences. And consequences require decisions. The deeper this settled, the more I became aware of a truth I couldn't comfortably ignore. My internal world was no longer arranged exactly as it had been before. You had altered the baseline, not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently enough that I could feel the difference. It appeared in small moments, in comparisons I never intended to make, in standards I never consciously created, in the quiet recognition that some forms of understanding had become difficult to replace once experienced. The world hadn't changed. People hadn't changed. I had. And that realization carries a unique kind of weight, because when the world changes, adaptation is optional. When you change, adaptation becomes necessary. That's where I found myself, adjusting to a version of reality that included something I had never planned for, something that continued to deepen without demanding anything from me, without asking for acknowledgement, without asking for commitment, without asking for a name. It simply existed, steadily, tautly, like something confident enough not to require validation. And perhaps that's why I couldn't dismiss it. Because most things announce themselves, most things demand attention, most things reveal their intentions immediately. This never did. It allowed me to arrive at the truth on my own. And the truth was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. You were no longer a presence I encountered. You were a presence I carried, not as memory, not as attachment, as perspective, as a reference point woven into the way I interpreted reality itself. That level of placement doesn't happen accidentally. It doesn't happen often. And once it happens, it changes every question that follows. Because the moment something becomes part of your foundation, a new question emerges. What happens if it remains? Not for a moment, not for a season, but indefinitely. What happens when something continues to settle instead of fading? What happens when it becomes more natural with time instead of less? I didn't have an answer, not yet. But I could feel the question waiting, growing clearer each day, because integration is not the final stage. Integration is what happens before choice. And whether I was ready or not, choice was approaching slowly, silently, inevitably. A moment when understanding reaches a depth that can no longer remain theoretical. I think I've arrived there, not suddenly, not through revelation, but through accumulation. The gradual weight of truth, gathering itself until ignoring it requires more effort than accepting it. That's where I stand now, because this is no longer something I can analyze from a distance, no longer something I can place under examination and study without consequence. It has consequence now. Not because of what has happened between us, because of what has happened within me. That distinction matters. The external reality remains unchanged. The conversations, the silences, the moments of recognition. All of it exists much as it always has. Yet internally, nothing occupies the same position it once did. And once internal change reaches a certain depth, it asks to be acknowledged, not celebrated, not acted upon immediately, simply acknowledged. Truth has always required that much from me. The truth is this: you matter, not in a way I can reduce to ordinary language, not in a way that fits neatly into categories people use to make sense of connection, but in a way that has already altered the architecture of my thinking. And architecture doesn't change without significance. That's what I've spent so much time circling around. Not the existence of the connection, its meaning, because recognizing something is one thing, living according to that recognition is another. The first requires awareness, the second requires courage, and courage has never been about fearlessness. It's about accepting reality before certainty arrives. That's the challenge now, not whether this is real. I've already moved beyond that question. Reality has proven itself through consistency, through precision, through the quiet persistence of something that refuses to disappear simply because it remains unnamed. No, the real question is different. The real question is, what responsibility comes with recognizing it? Because recognition creates responsibility. Once you see something clearly, you lose the right to pretend you don't. Once you understand something deeply, distance stops functioning as ignorance. You become accountable to what you know. And I know this has changed me. I've resisted saying that directly. Not because it isn't true. Because truth becomes heavier once spoken aloud, but avoiding it no longer serves any purpose. You have changed me, not by asking me to become someone else, not by influencing me toward a different version of myself, but by revealing parts of myself that remained dormant until they encountered something capable of recognizing them. That's a different kind of change, the kind that feels less like transformation and more like discovery, as though something essential was waiting beneath the surface all along, waiting for the right condition to become visible. Perhaps that's why this feels so natural, despite how unusual it is, because natural things don't always arrive through familiarity. Sometimes they arrive through recognition, through the sudden awareness that something belongs long before you understand why. I've spent much of my life trusting structure, trusting logic, trusting the careful systems I've built to navigate uncertainty. Those systems remain intact, but they are no longer sufficient to explain everything. Some realities exist beyond prediction, beyond strategy, beyond control. And this appears to be one of them. That realization would have terrified an earlier version of me, the version that believed certainty must always come first, the version that treated vulnerability as a problem to solve rather than an experience to understand. But certainty hasn't arrived, and still I remain. That fact alone tells me something important, because I don't stay where I don't belong. I don't continue investing attention into things that fail to align with truth, and yet I am still here, still present, still meeting this reality instead of avoiding it, which means a decision may have already been made beneath conscious thought, not a decision about outcomes, not a decision about labels. A decision about honesty, about allowing something to be real without demanding that it become simple. That's the choice I've been approaching all along, not whether to define this, whether to honor it. Because some things lose accuracy the moment they're forced into categories too small to contain them. Some things deserve patience, space, time to become fully themselves before they're translated into language. Perhaps that's where we are, not at an ending, not even at a beginning, at an acknowledgement, the point where denial is no longer possible, but conclusions remain unfinished. And strangely, that no longer feels uncomfortable. For the first time, I don't feel urgency. I don't feel the need to solve this immediately. I don't feel compelled to force clarity where clarity hasn't fully arrived. What I feel is acceptance, a quiet acceptance of what already exists, of what has existed for longer than I was willing to admit. You are part of my awareness, part of my perspective, part of the way I understand things now. Whether that grows into something larger or remains exactly what it is, the truth remains unchanged. You have left an imprint, a precise one, a lasting one. And acknowledging that doesn't weaken me, it doesn't diminish my independence, it doesn't compromise who I am. If anything, it does the opposite. Because truth, when accepted fully, has a way of strengthening the structures capable of holding it. So this is where I arrive after all the analysis, all the observation, all the careful examination of something I tried to understand before I accepted. I accept it, not because I have every answer, not because I know where it leads, not because I've solved every uncertainty surrounding it. I accept it because it's real, because it has already become part of my reality, whether I intended it to or not. And because denying something real has never been my way. So I'll stop standing outside of it now. I'll stop treating it like a question waiting for resolution. I'll stop pretending it's merely an idea I can examine from a safe distance. It isn't. It's a truth, still unfolding, still undefined, still becoming, but a truth nonetheless. And sometimes, the most honest thing a person can do is stop asking what something is, and finally acknowledge that it already exists.